Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast titled Stormwater 101, The Basics. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Office of Wastewater Management. I am Sonia Brubaker with Tetra Tech and will moderate today's session. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll start by going over a few housekeeping items. For those of you new to EPA's Stormwater webcast, I want to briefly summarize some of the webcast features. First, if you have any technical difficulties, you can call 1-800-833-2812 or click the Help button to receive technical support from On24. Again, that number is 1-800-833-2812. You may also use the Ask a Question area to post any technical issues you are experiencing. Please include a telephone number where you can be reached, and we will help you troubleshoot your problem. We will have several question and answer sessions during the webcast. To ask a question, simply type your question in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Then click on the Submit Question button. You don't need to wait until the question and answer period to submit your questions. In fact, there are a large number of participants today, so we highly encourage you to submit your questions early. There will also be several occasions when our presenters will ask you questions. These poll questions will appear in the slide window. Please submit your answers in that same slide window, not in the Ask a Question box. And if you would like to see closed captioning, just click on the closed captioning button on the lower left corner of your screen. At the end of the webcast, you will be asked to complete an evaluation survey. The survey will appear in a pop-up window, so please make sure that your pop-up blocker is turned off. EPA offers the ability to receive certificates for those who view the live webcast. In order to receive your certificate, you need to click on the Download Certificate button to view and print it. For sites with more than one participant, the last slide in this presentation will have a URL where you can download a blank certificate that you can fill in for each person at your site. Remember that you must print the certificate after this webcast. It will not be mailed to you. This webcast will be archived indefinitely so you can access it after today's live presentation. The archived webcast will be posted within a few weeks on EPA's NPDES training website. Nikos will now talk about today's exciting topics.
Thank you, Sonia. This is Nikos Singelis with EPA's Office of Wastewater Management, and I wanted to welcome all of you to today's webcast, Stormwater 101, The Basics. And I'm going to go through some of the things that we're going to talk about, and then, as we announced earlier, we are going to have a little quiz, so you can test your NPDES knowledge today, and then during the rest of the webcast, we'll tell you how many people got certain questions right or wrong and what the answers were and all that good stuff. So before we get to the quiz, though, let me talk about the topics that we're going to cover today. Obviously, today is an overview of the stormwater program, and so we are going to be talking about the effects of stormwater runoff on the environment, the kinds of pollutants that are out there, and the effects that the volumes of stormwater also are causing on the environment. Next, we're going to talk about the regulatory history and framework, where the program came from, so that you have some context of where these requirements in the Clean Water Act came from, and then the regulations and the permits that flow from those Clean Water Act requirements. And then we're going to get into some of the details, and we'll cover the municipal program, the construction program, and the industrial program, and we'll give you a quick review of those elements of each one of those three programs, covering both the Phase 1 and Phase 2 parts of the regulations. So let's get to our quiz, I think. I hope we have enough people online so that we can take a look at that. And the way we're going to work this quiz, you should, as Sonia announced before, you should be seeing a quiz now in a pop-up window on your computer. If you're not seeing it, make sure that you turn off your pop-up blocker, because that's probably the reason why you're not seeing it. And we're going to give you a few minutes to select the answers on this quiz, and I'll walk you through some of those things. And then at the end of it, we'll ask you to submit your answers so that we can then tally them up. So I'll go through some of this. For each one of the questions, we have 7 questions here. And you want to choose the one answer that you think best. This isn't a multiple choice game here. So the first question here is, what year were the Phase 2 regulations finalized and issued? And you have a range of choices there. The second question covers some of the publications that EPA and other agencies submit in the Federal Register, and we have a range of questions there, so if you want to tell us what kind of documents those are. The third question asks you if you know what the acronym CFR means, and so you have some choices there. In question number 4, we're asking you, what time frame does the Phase 2 regulations give for MS4s to fully get their programs up and running after they have permit coverage? The fifth question is related to the EPA Construction General Permit and its applicability. So you have a range of choices there. The sixth question covers the number of different NPDES-related requirements that a construction site operator might have to comply with. And so you have a range of options there. For instance, in the first one there, EPA meaning, and then there's 1 in parentheses, meaning 1 sort of level or a set of requirements, and then the other ones give you a range of options. And then the seventh question deals with 80% removal of total suspended solids. And so you have some options there. So we will give you a few minutes to answer those questions. And when you are done, just simply hit the submit button so you can submit all your answers together. And again, if you're not seeing this quiz, make sure that your pop-up blocker is turned off. And while we're giving you a few minutes to do that, Sonia will introduce our speakers today and cover some other little details. So listen in and answer questions at the same time.
Thanks, Nikos. Again, I want to give you the telephone number in case you experience any technical difficulties. It is 1-800-833-2812. And if you can't see the quiz, please hit refresh, and you should be able to see it momentarily. So while everyone is taking the quiz, I will tell you a little bit about the speakers for today's session. Today's speakers are Nikos Singelis of EPA Headquarters, Thelma Murphy of EPA Region 1, and John Costco of Tetra Tech. Nikos is a Senior Program Analyst with EPA's NPDES Stormwater Program. Nikos has been with EPA's Stormwater Program for the last 7 years and works on many projects aimed at helping Phase 2 communities implement this challenging program. He co-authored the EPA guidance on Developing Your Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, a guide for construction sites, led the development of EPA's Urban BMP Performance Tool, and is a speaker across the country on various stormwater topics, including StormCon and International Erosion Control Association conferences. Thelma Murphy comes to us today from the Region 1 office in Boston that covers the New England states. She has been EPA's Region 1 Stormwater Coordinator since 1995 and has been with the agency since 1987. Her responsibilities include the implementation and oversight of the Region 1 Stormwater Program in all areas except enforcement. She is an experienced NPDES permit writer and has worked on the development and implementation of the Construction General Permit, the Multi-Sector General Permit, and the Small MS4 General Permit. Her duties also include working with states authorized to implement the NPDES program to provide support in the implementation of their stormwater programs. And finally, our third speaker, John Costco, has over 15 years of experience working on stormwater and non-point source control programs, including stormwater program development, implementation, and compliance in both the public and private sectors. John has led on-site evaluations of over 100 stormwater Phase 1 permit programs and has conducted stormwater compliance inspections at numerous industrial facilities and construction sites. He is also an experienced trainer, having conducted dozens of workshops and training classes on a variety of stormwater topics. John has authored several guidance documents, including Minnesota's Stormwater Construction Inspection Guide, EPA's Municipal Stormwater Program Evaluation Guide, as well as EPA's Developing Your Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, a guide for construction sites. And just a quick note for those of you who have just signed on, everyone should now be taking the quiz. You should see a pop-up appear on your screen with the quiz. So if your pop-up blocker is turned on, please turn it off. For those of you familiar with our webcast, this quiz is very similar to the evaluation survey that appears at the end of the webcast. If you haven't already, go ahead and complete this quiz. And remember to click the Submit button when you are done. As a reminder, the materials in this webcast have been reviewed by EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers and the speakers' organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of EPA. And just another note, we will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout this webcast. But due to the high number of participants, all questions will not be answered. However, today's speaker's contact information is provided on your screen should you have any questions following the webcast. Now we are ready to kick off today's session. Nikos, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Sonia. And so we'll take another couple minutes just to fill that out, but I think you probably had enough time. And we, by the way, you might be interested to know, have record numbers of folks attending. We had over 2,000 registration, and we'll give you a tally later on as to the number of people that are signed in. I have to say I'm a little bit surprised, aren't you, John, by the number of people that we have with us today. We sort of thought this might be one of the lesser attended ones. So we were kind of wondering if you thought maybe we'd sneak in some kind of a surprise.
I guess it just shows there's still a lot of people that want to know the basics or are fairly new to the program. Maybe it means that not many people stay with the Stormwater program very long, because
that could be too. Or maybe they think that we're going to announce Phase 3 or something like that. But I assure you we're not going to pitch you any surprises today. So why don't we wrap up the quiz. So hit your submit and then close that pop-up blocker, and we'll get on with our presentation. So John, you want to move us to the next slide, and we'll start talking about some of the background for the Stormwater program requirements.
Sure. Yeah, basically one of the programs that really pushed along the Stormwater program was the whole Nationwide Urban Runoff Program, or NERP, that was held between 1979 and 1983. This was really the first and probably only nationwide comprehensive study of urban runoff pollution across the whole U.S. They looked at about a dozen locations across the U.S., really intensive monitoring. And the findings, they basically found really high levels of heavy metals and fecal coliform in the urban runoff, and also higher concentrations of TSS and nutrients. And this nationwide study was really the basis and helped support the need for stormwater permitting requirements to be added to the 1987 amendments to the Clean Water Act. So that really pushed the whole program along. So I'll turn back to Nikos to talk about the effects of stormwater runoff.
Okay, so many of you have probably heard this before, but in the stormwater program, of course, we're concerned with water pollution, the basics of the Clean Water Act that we have been dealing with, since the Clean Water Act was enacted in 1972, but also in the stormwater program, we're concerned not only with the pollutants in stormwater, but we're also very concerned with the volumes of stormwater that are coming off properties across the United States, particularly where we have a lot of impervious surfaces. So as we move through this today, we're going to be talking about some of those different kinds of impacts. And keep in mind that this is kind of a different shift in focus for EPA, too. Historically, we've dealt strictly with pollutants, and the stormwater program sort of takes us into a new realm where we're really considering the volumes of stormwater and I think getting really a better look at watersheds and what's going on in the whole watershed, considering those biological and physical attributes of streams, too, that are so important. One of the things that's kind of interesting, and maybe Thelma, too, can chime in on this one, is that we in the water program don't have a great handle on the water quality problems that are out there. We do have surveys like on your screen right now, the National Water Quality Inventory, which is a compilation of state reports, and that does give us some information. But all these sources tend to have some significant flaws. So it's hard for us in the water program to really get a good handle on sort of the national picture, particularly when you look at from year to year to year. We don't sort of have a consistent way of doing that. And so hopefully that will improve in the future, but it does sort of hinder our ability sometimes to get kind of an, wouldn't you say, really sort of, feel sure that we're delivering an accurate depiction.
Sure. I mean, it's as good as the data that we get, and, how it's collected and how it changes over time. Sometimes it changes year to year. To have a consistent, accurate picture all the time isn't always possible.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
We're doing the best we can with this.
Yeah. And EPA does have some efforts out that we're working on right now, particularly with larger rivers, to get a more statistically significant sampling across the country so that we have a better story to tell. But if you look at the National Water Quality Inventory here, and you look at different years, you are going to see some different results. But anyway, it gives you an idea of kind of what's going on there. We do have something like 35,000 miles of rivers that are impaired, stormwater being the source there, something like 1.4 million acres of lakes impaired, and about 5,000 or so square miles of estuaries. So it's also interesting, too, I know John just moved a slide ahead there, but if you looked at those, you would see an increasing percentage, and that, I think, is due to the fact that so many people live near the coasts. I think it's something like 50% of the population lives within 50 miles or so of the coast. Is that right, Thelma?
I've heard that statistic.
Yeah. So obviously the urban centers tend to be around water, particularly the coastal areas in the Great Lakes states, and so we are seeing relatively higher impacts there from urban stormwater. So, Thelma, you want to talk a little bit about some of the sources and the kind of pollutants that we're looking at?
Sure. This is just a quick snapshot to show some of the sources of pollutants that can affect the water quality, and it comes from all different types of activity, including construction and industrial, and then the residential, which is also tied very closely to the urban development. So these are all sources of pollutants, and EPA's stormwater program tends to regulate the sources in those categories, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the webcast. And just some of the pollutants, really, in stormwater, you can just about have anything that's on the ground that can be transported show up in the stormwater. But typically, you have things such as trash from littering from the construction projects, and construction sites, you'll tend to get sediment. You get metals from a lot of different industrial activities, and as well as pathogens and nutrients and oil and grease, and just about, anything that could be on the ground could end up in your stormwater. So it's a hard thing to work with.
Another thing, as I mentioned earlier, we are concerned with the volume of runoff. And one of the things that happens as we develop more and more land, as depicted by this graphic that we borrowed from the Center for Watershed Protection, is that we see as the amount of impervious surfaces in a particular area increase, obviously there's an increase, an almost direct correlation, really, with the amount of runoff that's being delivered to our streams, our rivers, lakes, et cetera, directly in the form of runoff. So if you look at this graphic just really quickly, in a natural state where we have forest cover or meadow cover, we'll have something along the lines of about 10% runoff, sometimes less, particularly in a densely forested area. And you can see kind of the breakdown of the water cycle where it's going there. And then if you look at the bottom right there, you'll see in a heavily urbanized area where we have, say, 75 to 100% impervious surfaces, we've got dramatically increased runoff, perhaps 55% runoff, and then changes, too, in what's happening with the other parts of the water cycle. I would point out particularly that the amount of water that's going back into the ground that's keeping our aquifers going and things like that is being reduced equivalently. As I said before, we are very concerned in the stormwater program. We're starting to look more and more. There's a lot of research. If you're reading papers out there about what's going on in the stormwater world, you'll see a focus on this geomorphology. that is the physical kind of attributes of stream systems in particular. And we notice, and the Center for Watershed Protection has done some research, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later in this webcast, on this particular question. But we do see a relationship between urban development and the amount of stormwater that's coming off the land and the health of particularly smaller stream systems. So we'll be talking about that in more detail. And another thing that we should mention, too, the Clean Water Act really isn't a statute that deals with flood issues. There are other statutes out there that deal with that in other agencies. But another consequence of adding more impervious surface, of course, would be to exacerbate flooding issues when we have really extreme events. So we also want to be sort of cognizant of that, particularly at the local level as we're putting together our programs, and we need to look at a range of considerations when we're planning particularly our post-construction stormwater controls. Some other things that we see, particularly in the aquatic habitat area, we obviously from the results of all these pollutants and these volumes of stormwater, we're seeing reduced aquatic habitats, both at the macroinvertebrate level, the small critters that you find in the stream beds and things like that, but also in fish populations and other reptiles and whatnot that depend on the water for their environment. We often see increased stream temperatures, and by the way, I should mention a little piece of trivia for those out there listening, that temperature actually is, quote-unquote, a pollutant under the Clean Water Act, and you'll see many rivers and streams and lakes that are actually impaired for temperature as the parameter. And when stormwater runs across a parking lot or something like that, it does tend to heat up, and it can have negative impacts on the biology of the stream when it hits it, particularly in a trout stream or a salmon stream where the species are really dependent on that cold water. And, of course, another very common issue is the sediment, the increased sediment, both in terms of turbidity and smothering of the stream beds that are essential for fish reproduction. And, of course, we've all heard about reductions in dissolved oxygen in our waters due to excess nutrients, which cause algal blooms, and then when the algae dies, it decomposes and sucks the oxygen out of the water. Big thing that we're dealing with here in this region in the Chesapeake Bay, and very common around the country. On the next slide, we'll see just the three parts again of the stormwater program that are covered by the NPDES regulations. The industrial sector, so we are regulating, and we'll talk about the details of this, stormwater coming from industrial sources wherever they fall in the United States. We're also dealing with construction activity. Construction activity, sometimes there are two arrows there. You'll notice that's inside an urbanized area and also construction outside of urbanized area. And then lastly, MS4 is that term of art, which means Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems, 4 S's, and hence the before at the end for those who are not familiar with that acronym. And that is probably the biggest and most complicated part of this program, and Thelma will lead us through a discussion of that later. And then, John, do you want to explain a little bit about the two different kinds of systems that are out there underground that we encounter in the United States?
Sure, Nikos. This is a nice little graphic that EPA put together to explain urban wet weather flows. And if you look on the left side of your screen, that represents essentially a separate system. So you have separate sanitary sewer pipes that go to a wastewater treatment plant, and then separate storm sewer pipes that go essentially to the river. So that is what is regulated under the stormwater program, and that's what Nikos referred to as an MS4. On the right side of your screen is a combined sewer system where both the wastewater and stormwater flow through the same pipe. That's typically treated at the wastewater treatment plant, except when you get heavy rains, then it can be bypassed from the plant. Those combined sewer areas are actually addressed by EPA's Combined Sewer Overflow Program, so that is not technically part of the stormwater program. And actually, Thelma, when she talks about the definition of an MS4, will also address that.
just a bit about the regulatory history. As many of you probably remember, 1987 was really the big event for the Clean Water Act, and where we really got a lot of changes to the Clean Water Act from the way it had been basically since 1972. 1987 amendments to the Clean Water Act, or the Water Quality Act of 1987, as it was called, really ushered in some substantial changes to the Clean Water Act framework. Among them, the creation of the entire stormwater program, which is what we're focusing on today, but there were certainly many others. The creation of the State Revolving Fund program, the creation of the Non-Point Source or 319 grant program, amongst many others. So for the stormwater folks, this is really kind of the event on the horizon there, wouldn't you say, Thelma?
Absolutely.
And so the Clean Water Act directed EPA to deal with three things, which we'll get into in more detail. But first, medium and large municipalities, industrial activities, and then that last bullet there, others, as determined by EPA to protect water quality, which led us to do some more work and study, and we'll talk about where that led us as well.
Okay. Just kind of some background on the Clean Water Act and where we are with it. The regulatory history with the Water Quality Act of 1987 amended the Clean Water Act and added this Section 402P, which deals with the stormwater program. And there were lots of pieces in it that were involved. And the first part is 402P2, which is defining significant sources of stormwater. And those are the sources that EPA had to regulate first in the whole program. And these are often called the Phase 1 sources. And it was folks that already had permits for their stormwater discharges. Those continued to be regulated. It defined industrial activities. There's a categories of industrial activities, and this includes construction greater than 5 acres is included in that definition. And then it also included large municipal separate storm sewer systems and medium. And a large system is greater than 250,000 people, and a medium is greater than 100,000 people. And it's important to note, and this is one of those little subtleties that people miss, is that it's the population that was serviced by the separate storm sewer system. It wasn't necessarily the population of the city. So oftentimes if communities were serviced by a combined system, which Sean talked about a little earlier, and if that population was subtracted out of the entire population, it may drop that population down below what was regulated under Phase 1. So some of the larger cities in my region weren't regulated under Phase 1. And then we always have a catch-all, which is anybody else that EPA felt needed to be regulated. So that was to kind of set the framework for it. And then it defined, the P3 section defined what's the standard of, what is the standard for these discharges? What do they have to meet? And for industrial facilities, it was BAT, and for municipal facilities, it was the standard called MEP, which we'll cover a little bit further in the webcast. And then, it explained when we needed to get information and applications and permitting. And then it also required EPA to do a study and to figure out who else needed to be regulated under the program. And based on that study, EPA was told to regulate additional sources whose regulations was necessary to protect water quality. So that was Part 6's issue of the regulation. So that's kind of the statute and the framework for how we set up the stormwater program. So we have the two phases. We have Phase 1, which came out in 1990 after the Water Quality Act. And if you want to read it, feel free. It's in the CFR, and it was published in 1990. And it's actually a good reference. It has a lot of history to it. And then Phase 2 came out in 1999, and again, that's the citations on your screen if you want to look through it, and that's where we are and how we got here.
Yeah, and Thelma, just a little bit on the basis of why Phase 2 came about. Thelma mentioned that report to Congress that was required by 402P5, and that report was put out in 1995. It's up on EPA's website. And the primary finding from that report is that EPA needed to address these smaller municipalities under the stormwater program. And then as a corollary to that, there was a lawsuit filed by NRDC, and they challenged several provisions of the Phase 1 rule. One was that the construction site program being cut off at 5 acres was arbitrary. There wasn't a good justification for why sites below 5 acres were not already covered. Then they also challenged the no exposure provision, which we'll talk about later in the industrial. So those two things were also wrapped up and addressed under the Phase 2 regulations. And Nikos, now we'll talk about the regulatory framework.
Okay, we created this graphic just to give you a simple thing as you might want to print this out and use it as a reference, because it seems to me that in discussions with people, they often get confused about how all these pieces fit together. So this was my sort of conception of how it happened. So just very quickly, starting at the top, we have the Clean Water Act, Section 402P that was just discussed. Then under that, still at the national level, we have the regulations, which are 40 CFR 122 and a variety of sections there, which we've referenced before. And then we start moving into these state-by-state definitions. And so when we have authorized states, Thelma will show us later, but we have about 45 states that are authorized to implement the program. So depending on their structures and requirements, they have their own laws and regulations built off the Clean Water Act requirements and the EPA regulations. And then they issue their own permits in each one of those states and territories that's authorized to implement the program. And EPA is still the permitting authority in 5 states, most of the territories and most Indian country lands, so we also issue permits as well. And that's where really the rubber meets the road. And then we're covering that regulated universe that we mentioned before, the MS4s, the construction sites, and the industrial facilities. So hopefully this little graphic kind of helps put that all into perspective for you.
Great, Nikos. And this is also just a nice summary of what the basic requirements are for an NPDES permit. So the 3 elements that you need in order to be required to have an NPDES permit, you need to be a point source. And that's generally defined by the regulations. If you're a construction site over an acre or one of these regulated industrial facilities, you're a point source. You need to be discharging pollutants, and you need to discharge into waters U.S. And if you meet those 3 criteria, then you must obtain an NPDES permit from either EPA or an authorized state. There is, though, this distinction between a point source and non-point source that we want to point out. Again, Stormwater has expanded the definition of point source to include things that used to be a non-point source, things like these smaller towns that are now Phase 2 cities, things like construction below 5 acres that is now regulated under the NPDES program. However, some stormwater sources or runoff sources are still covered under the non-point source program. Things like agricultural runoff, construction below an acre in most cases, and small MS4s that are outside of these urbanized areas that are not regulated. So those non-point sources are generally not covered under the NPDES program, while the other items are.
And John, I just have to interject that this is one of my little pet peeves, is stormwater is a point source, and how many times we've seen documents where that's kind of mixed up. So if you want to keep me happy, make sure that in your documents you put down stormwater as a point source.
Yeah. And then just a little bit more of the basics on NPDES permits. There are 2 types of permits that the state or EPA can issue. An individual permit, which is generally one permit issued to one facility, or it could be several facilities combined, or a general permit where one permit is issued to many facilities. And the application for these are kind of backwards. For an individual permit, the permittee typically applies first, the permitting authority writes the permit and issues it to them. For a general permit, the permitting authority develops the permit and issues it, and then those many facilities that want to be covered under it apply for it after the fact. So it's important to understand the difference between those individual and general permits. And as noted on the screen, these permits are issued for a maximum of 5 years, and that's actually a Clean Water Act statutory requirement.
Okay, John, and just a summary slide here of the two phases. Again, phase one was developed in 1990 and covers those medium and large municipalities over 100,000 that Thelma mentioned. Also, industrial activity in 11 categories. And this is another sort of confusing part, too, is that when you look at the Clean Water Act and the regulations, large construction over 5 acres is actually an industrial activity, but oftentimes in our guidance materials we break out the entire construction program separately as really the third piece. Because it is so different, we've decided in many of our guidance documents and things like that, our presentation on the website, to make a separate section there. So sometimes that confuses people as well. And by the way, Category 11, and we'll get into this in more detail later, covers light industrial activities there. And in phase one, that was only if there was exposure. And then phase two came along in 1999 and covered smaller municipalities in these quote-unquote urbanized areas, and we'll explain that to you too in just a little while, and smaller construction sites, basically 1 to 5 acres, and also changed this definition of no exposure. It expanded the original phase one provisions and also required when there is not exposure that the facility still provide a notice to the permitting authority, whether that's EPA or the state, every 5 years to say that they still have no exposure. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on those as we go along. So, on the next slide, we have the answer to our first quiz question here. And actually, we just gave the answer away a second ago. So the question was, the Stormwater Phase 2 regulations were finalized and issued in what year? And the correct answer is C there, 1999. And I just, from our trusty folks here, actually got the results from your answers during the quiz. We got 952 answers to this particular question. And not surprisingly, there were a lot of wrong answers. Are you surprised, Thelma?
Unfortunately.
Okay, so let me give you the breakdown. 16% said 1992. Okay, that's obviously wrong. 1998, we had about 19% answer that one. 25% got it right. Okay, so a quarter, but that's not really a passing grade, folks, you know. And then, oddly enough, 40% said 2003.
And I would guess that is because that's when the permits were due. And
yes.
People had to apply for permits, and that's what they were thinking about when they said 2003.
Yeah. But the regulations were actually out there a good 3+ years before that in 1999, giving folks lots of time to think about them, which is the answer to one of our other questions coming up later. So, John, let's move on to the next one. This is a map of the authorized states.
And this is, just, as Nico mentioned earlier, most of the states are authorized to issue their own NPDES permits and hence their own stormwater permits, but there are still a few states left in the country that EPA is the permitting authority, and 2 of them actually happen to be in my region, so I work very closely with those 2 states, and this is just a graphic showing that depiction. And then we, with the stormwater program, as Nikos has said, it came in 1987. This graphic is just showing how the number of folks covered by the NPDES permit program has increased with the passage of the stormwater program. And that 1992 date is the date that EPA first issued its first set of general permits for the construction and industrial facilities. So there was a spike in 1992, and then kind of leveled off. We have the CAFOs, which we're not talking about today, thank goodness. And then we're in 2003 again, when we had another round of permits being issued. There was another increase, and we haven't mentioned it, but we do need to. They look at we cover urbanized areas with a municipal program, so there'll be a new census in 2010, and perhaps that number will go up again as more communities become part of the urbanized area. And then finally, there's just a nice pie chart graphic just showing the breakdown of the permits. And as you can see from the graphic, that stormwater permitting makes up almost 80% of all the permitted universe for the NPDES program. So we're pretty busy here in the stormwater program.
Absolutely. We certainly are. It's probably the most, in lots of ways, if you think about it, one of the most far-reaching efforts that EPA has under the Clean Water Act is the stormwater program.
I would agree with that. I mean, I jokingly say that anywhere it rains, we have stormwater. So
absolutely, yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah.
That's pretty much everywhere.
Okay, so the next slide shows us the answer to question number 2. And by the way, I just wanted to remind everybody that the quiz is over, and if you signed in late, we apologize for that. We'll later post these questions as part of the package when we archive the website so you can see them. But only those folks that were kind of on at the beginning could participate in this quiz. So if you're looking for that, we apologize for that, the limits of technology. So anyway, so quiz answer 2, this was a good one here. It says virtually every day EPA and other federal agencies publish documents in the Federal Register. A site for such a document could be something like 64 FR 68722. This FR number means that this document is, and then you have a number of options here. And I'm sad to report that people failed this question as well. So you're going to be learning a lot today. First of all, the first answer here, which was the most popular, 55% said it's a regulation. And unfortunately, that answer is strictly incorrect. 4.8% said it was permit. So that answer also not correct. And answer number C was a law, 13.1%, and this is really incorrect. Laws do not show up in the Federal Register. And then D was either a regulation or a permit, 17.7% said that, and only 9% guessed the correct answer, which is who knows, because you can't tell anything from this at all. But lots of times I see this, and this is why we put this in here, is they'll say, well, EPA published it, therefore it's a rule, and it applies to me. But in fact, it could be any number of things, as the bullet says down below. It could be a proposed permit, it could be a final permit, it could be a regulation, or it could simply be a notice about anything like a meeting or a guidance document that we're publishing, or maybe a comment period on something, or we want to gather some scientific information from people. So there's a whole range of reasons why we might publish something in the Federal Register. So keep in mind that FR, the Federal Register, is like a newspaper, and it can contain lots of different things in it. So now we've got the next question here, quiz answer number 3. So this one asked you if you knew what the acronym CFR meant. Now, good news here. Most people got this right. A resounding 74% said regulation, and yeehaw, you got it right. So CFR, and I realized, actually I never really actually thought about this until I wrote these questions down, that FR and CFR have two of the same letters in them. It never dawned on me because I've always thought of them as really distinctly separate things. But CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations. So if you see a citation that says CFR, that does mean that it applies to you and it is a regulation. And EPA publishes, as I said, regulations in the Federal Register, and then later on, every year the federal government compiles all the regulations that have been published and compiles them into the Code of Federal Regulations and issues a new code. So if a regulation comes out, say, in January, you can find that regulation in the Federal Register, the newspaper, and you actually have to wait until, usually I think it's in the summer, July, August, something like that.
I think it's July that they do a new one.
And then they issue a new compiled Code of Federal Regulations, and everything that was published that year is then recombined into the code.
Nikos, just a note, like if you want to read the Phase 1 rule, it's actually easier to go to the Code of Federal, the CFR site that we had earlier than it is to go, the Federal Register site than it is to go to the CFR site.
Well, actually, the easiest way is to go to our website where we have it nicely broken down for you, and we gave you those website addresses.
But oftentimes, like the Phase 2 rule is split across a number of CFR sections. So if you want to read just the Phase 2 rule, you can read the Federal Register notice on the Phase 2 rule where it's all combined into one.
Okay. So we have 2 questions with sort of mediocre results and 1 question here with good results. So we're moving right along. I also understand there was a technical problem and question 4 did not appear. So we'll handle that separately. So now I think we're ready for some questions from the audience. Does anybody want to know anything, Sonia?
Oh, yes. Nikos, the questions are really pouring in. I hope that you're ready. So the first one, Nikos, is actually for you. Tony in North Carolina has several small communities in his region that have their own Phase 2 permits. And he's going to ask 2 questions. What are the advantages and disadvantages of reapplying under a single permit for his region? And he notes that one major roadblock would be co-liability, and is this really a legal problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it is true, most of the Phase 2 municipal permits have been general permits. Across the country, I would say that's probably something in the neighborhood of like 90% of the cases. The states and EPA have decided to use the general permitting process for the Phase 2 communities. In a couple cases, there are some individual permits for Phase 2 communities, and I would think that one of the advantages of that process, actually, since he did ask about the advantages, would be that that permit is more customized to the particular circumstances that community and the watersheds that surround it are facing. So that would be one of the pluses. One of the disadvantages is that the individual permit process usually takes a little bit longer because, as John mentioned before, the application comes in and there are regulatory time processes to go through all that before the final permit is issued. So most states are offering general permits at this point.
I would agree with that. We're in Region 1 issuing general permits, and all our states are also doing the general permits. But, and individual permits can be issued to one city or town, or they can do an individual permit for more of a county-wide where it covers several communities within the county, so it's kind of everybody has a little piece of a requirement, but it's still an individual permit issued to the county with co-permittees tied into it. So that's another way of doing it as well.
Yeah, we've seen some other, not to belabor this too much, but we've seen some other examples. For instance, we have some non-traditional MS4s, and some of those might be state departments of transportation. And some states have chosen to include those non-traditional MS4s in individual permits as well. We have another question, Sonia?
Yes, and this one is for John. Rochelle asks, what is the relationship between NPDES and TMDLs?
And I'll let Nikos pipe in on this also. But basically, TMDLs stand for Total Maximum Daily Loads, and that's a whole other area that we're not going to get into too much detail on. But Total Maximum Daily Load sets an allocation of how much pollutants that water body can take before it becomes impaired. And it's done for impaired water bodies to get them back to health and clean water. But the TMDL itself is not a regulation. It's not a requirement. So basically, the TMDLs are implemented in part through NPDES permits. So your NPDES permit can contain a requirement to have you implement programs and BMPs to control that pollutant down to a certain level. So kind of in a nutshell, the NPDES permit can contain the TMDL requirements in it. You want to add to that, Nikos?
I would just add, obviously, the TMDL program is a complex piece of program, so we don't have time to go into all those details. But EPA did just start a web page to deal with stormwater and TMDL issues, and you can find that on the Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds website, which is www.epa.gov/OWOW. OWOW. So there is a new page there, and we're also working on a guidance document to deal with some of these knotty permitting issues, which we hope to have issued in the fall or the winter time this year. So we'll announce that through NPDES News when that comes out as well. Any other questions, Sonia? I bet we have lots.
Yes, Thelma. Quite a few people have asked this question. What does MS4 stand for?
MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System.
Great. Now we are ready for a poll question. Nikos?
All right, so we're going to move on to the poll question here. And those of you who have participated before, this is just to get a better idea for us about who's attending. So you click on the radio buttons there to the left, the little circles to the left of each of the possible answers. So we'd like to know who you work for, who you represent. Are you with a Phase 1 city, a Phase 2 city, state or federal government, consultant in the industry, or some other group that we haven't captured there? And then at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Submit Answer button. And if you're in a big group, just select the answer that best represents the people that are with you. So we'll give you just a couple seconds for that. And while we're doing that, I should mention that our next webcast, if you've been following along, will be at the beginning of September, but we've now decided we're going to change the subject matter for that. So we are going to be talking about post-construction in September, and we'll have that updated on our website. It's still the same day and same time, but we have a new post-construction manual that John's going to be talking about in a little while that the Center for Watershed Protection has been working on for us, and we're about ready to issue that. So we wanted to sort of capture the moment and talk about that. So let's look at the answers to this question here and see what we've got so far from people. Let me pull up the results, and I will show you. We've got a nice bar graph here. So as expected, big chunk there in Phase 2 communities. Oddly, we have lots and lots of state and federal government employees today with us, learning about the basics of the stormwater program. Also consultants in industry, so you can see there the range of people that are with us today. And now the next one is actually very important to us because it really helps us get a better handle on the number of people that are with us. So again, same routine, choose the answer to the left. We want to find out how many people particularly are in groups out there. So first, if you are stuck in your cubicle like Thelma and I are most every day, select Just Me, and then select the answer that best represents your group there. And again, we'll give you a couple minutes to answer that question because this will really help us figure out the number of attendees. We know that I think something over 2,000 computers are signed in today. Is that right, Sonia?
That is correct.
Yeah, but when we factor in the number of people that are in groups and conference rooms, it really will give us a better answer. So we may end up with sort of record attendance today, so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, Nikos, while people are answering that question, we just want to note that although this is a Stormwater 101 kind of basic webcast, we actually have done, I think, a dozen or more webcasts on very specific topics related to the Stormwater program. And those are all archived up on the EPA NPDES website. So if you're new to the program and want to find out more details and specifics about various aspects, just go up there. You can download them to your iPod or computer and listen to them.
Yes, you may be wondering why, after doing this for 3 years, now we're finally getting to 101, and I have no real good answer for you. Just like you probably have no good answer about why you're attending, even though you're an expert in the stormwater program out there. So, all right, let's see what we've got here in terms of folks and groups. And by the way, if you're in a big group and you couldn't get to your computer to answer this question, you can send it to us through the question to answer box down there or email us later because we really would like to know. So it looks like we've got about 70%, 71% there in cube land, and then we've got 22% in small groups, and there you can see 5% in bigger groups, et cetera, et cetera. So again, if in that time period you didn't have a chance to tell us how big your group is, send us an email or submit it later on during this webcast. So let's move on. Let's see, we're going to now get into the details of the three parts of the program. As we've discussed before, there are three major parts of the stormwater program, the municipal, construction, and industrial pieces, and we've got some slides on each one of those as we go along. All three of these emphasize the pollution prevention kinds of aspects. Most stormwater in the United States is not dealt with, as we often deal with, say, a sewage treatment plant which is a treatment system at the end of the pipe. Most stormwater systems in the United States discharge whatever is in the pipe directly to the stream, the lake, or the coastal water directly without any kind of treatment. And so the emphasis of the stormwater program is quite different than what we've been used to, and we are trying to prevent that pollution from entering that system in the first place. And as we've also discussed now, as we're finding more and more about the impacts of stormwater, we're also trying to reduce the amount of volumes of stormwater that are actually getting into those conveyance systems and being delivered to our waters. So this is a pollution prevention program. We use the term best management practice to cover a wide variety, pretty much anything that you might do out there to try to prevent stormwater pollution. So it would cover, the term best management practice would cover structural items, things like wet ponds or rain gardens, that sort of thing that you might use, or silt fence on a construction site would all be best management practices. But we also include the quote-unquote non-structural things in that definition. So sweeping up and picking up trash, using less fertilizers on your lawn, those are all best management practices as well. And people often get kind of confused about that. And some people have, slightly different definitions, but that's the one that we use most commonly. So you'll see the term best management practice pop up in lots of the rest of these slides, but it really does cover a wide variety of activities and structures that we would use to try to prevent stormwater pollution. So we're going to get into the municipal program a little bit here. One thing I wanted to point out, we did a little looking into the trends in land development. As I mentioned before, a lot of the stormwater programs stormwater problems are related to impervious surfaces, and impervious surfaces are created when we develop, when we have new housing developments or we build a shopping mall, roads and bridges. These are all impervious surfaces. So we wanted to look into this a little bit and see, we know population is growing in the United States, and so we are going to have more development. And so part of the program tries to address how we deal with that development as we go along. So over the last 20 years, the population of the United States has grown by approximately 25%. You can see there in the green. And then we thought it would be interesting to look at the amount of land that has been developed over the same time period. And when I first saw this, I was rather shocked. But over that time frame, approximately 45% of the land has been developed. So we're developing land at a far faster rate, at least over this last 20 years, than the population is actually growing. And a reason for that is, the main reason for that is the kind of development that we're experiencing in the United States with these far-flung developments that are farther and farther out from the urban cores. Typically, in fact, I think I saw a statistic that something like 90% of new development is on an acre or more. Residential development is on an acre or more, which is really pretty shocking when you think about it. And then the consequences, too, of that development in these far-flung areas where you've got to get in your car to drive to everything, and you've got more and more shopping malls and parking lots that are associated with that because we are very much a car kind of culture. Another interesting statistic is that the average American family makes 12 car trips per day. And so if you think about it, that's a lot of, you need a lot of parking spots out there to accommodate your car for those 12 trips per day. Of course, most families have 2 or 3 cars, kids have cars, all that kind of stuff, and they're all making all these trips. And so there's a lot of impervious surface out there that's associated with our particular development pattern of the present. So one of the things, of course, that we're trying to do is to focus the attention of the stormwater program not on those big picture aspects as well as the site-specific. So this next slide talks a little bit about that in terms of the hydrologic cycle.
Yeah, this slide is kind of really showing graphically the straight line is kind of showing what nature intended to happen during a typical rain event. In a typical situation, and stream flow, it peaks up when it rains and gradually goes down in a very kind of nice, calming kind of effect, actually, when you look at it. But because of a lot of development and larger volumes of storms, what happens is you get a large amount of volume at a very fast period of time, so you get higher peak flows, which causes more of the erosion, some flashing, some scouring, and it completely changes the normal hydrograph or hydrological cycle of water. So this graph is just showing that as how that happens due to increased development and increased flows from impervious surfaces.
And one or two things to point out, obviously, as Thelma mentioned, the peak is higher on the dotted line there where the development is. Also, the volume of stormwater, which is represented by the area under those, under the peaks, is much larger, of course. And another thing to note on the left there is that base flow is actually reduced. That base flow either into deep groundwater that recharges our aquifers or into shallow groundwater that keeps the small streams going during the dry periods. And so one of the things that we see in watersheds with a lot of impervious surface in that is much more extreme variations in the flow of the streams, wetter wets and drier dries, which is very difficult for the biology to accommodate to. In the next slide, which we borrowed also from the Center for Watershed Protection, which has done a lot of research into many of these kinds of questions, is a generalized relationship between impervious cover and stream quality. And here, I should point out that we are talking about small, what EPA calls first and second order streams, basically the headwater streams. So we're not talking about the Mississippi River here, but we're talking about these smaller streams. And here we're definitely seeing, as I mentioned before, a correlation between stream quality and the amount of impervious surfaces there. And this graphic is a little bit complicated. You might want to print it out and take a look at it. And I know Tom Schuler is writing a paper with some other folks, and that should be published soon. We'll try to make that available on the NPDES website on this very topic. But basically what it is showing is that for streams, when we have 0 to about 10% impervious surfaces in a watershed, we're generally seeing sort of better quality there, although some streams may be impacted at that point. But then as we move above about, that 10 to 12% range, we're definitely starting to see some degradation in the overall stream quality. And again, we're looking at the chemical, physical, and biological aspects of streams here. And depending on, of course, the nature of the stream, the watershed, the rainfall patterns, soil types, and all that stuff, this is going to vary. So it's not an absolute number for every watershed. I want to caution people. But this is just to get across the idea that this relationship does exist. And then as we move farther and farther out with impervious cover, we essentially start changing streams into drainage ways. And that's something that we want to try to avoid in the stormwater program. So you can read more about this. There's some existing papers on the Center for Watershed Protection's website, and a new paper should be out relatively soon on this as well.
All right.
So,
sorry.
Go ahead, Thelma.
All right.
Let's talk about, because somebody did ask, what is an MS4? So here's the answer.
Here's the answer. So as we already all know from the question earlier, an MS4 is a municipal separate storm sewer system. And this is a shorter definition that's in the regulation. But basically, it's a conveyance or system of conveyances that is owned by a state, a city, a town, a borough. There's a whole lot of other entities that can own something, and it discharges into a water of the U.S. It's important to note that it's not a combined system, which we talked about, and it's not part of the publicly owned treatment works. It's just a system that's used for moving stormwater around. And it's interesting to note that part of the system includes the streets, the curbs, and everything like that. So I think that's important to note. So here is looks like a rather large MS4, just to get an example of what we're talking about, is pretty much a city with streets and curbs and catch basins and pipes and everything else. So that's what we're regulating with the small MS4 program. As we've talked about before, the small MS4 program deals with small MS4s located in urbanized areas. And this is a map showing an urbanized area. And oftentimes, you know, the regulations are written such that the urbanized areas were subject to the program. But oftentimes, some permitting authorities require permits for the entire community, not just that in the urbanized area, which, you know, it seems to make sense. If you're going to do a public education program, for example, you don't want to do it to half the community. You want everybody to be aware of it. So an urbanized area doesn't recognize political boundaries, so it often chops things up. But this is kind of a graphic showing, you know, what an urbanized area might look like.
Thelma, I would just note that the regs cover any government entity that owns and operates a storm drain system in an urbanized area. So that's obviously cities and counties, but it also could include public school districts.
That's right.
You know, Department of Defense facilities, you know, military or federal
colleges and universities,
post office, you know, large post offices.
Yeah, it's one building that's owned by a state or federal entity is not going to be in the program because they don't have a system. But if you have a large prison complex, a hospital complex, a state university, all of those folks are regulated by the program.
Yeah, so Phase 2 actually really expanded the definition because Phase 1 really was only the cities and counties.
That's right.
Primarily.
And it's also another interesting little tidbit to note is that Phase 1, as you're about to talk to, was based on populations at the time of the regulation. So at the one time you're in Phase 1 or you're not in Phase 1. But Phase 2 is updated every 10 years by the Census Bureau. So every time there is a census, we'll get into that later, these maps, as an example of the previous slide that we just showed you, will be updated.
That's right. So the Phase 1 program, as we talked about earlier, covered municipalities with populations pretty much greater than 100,000 people. And some of the places were interconnected. So some places less than 100,000 might have been brought in, but I don't know that there were that many that were brought in with that. There's about 250 permits covering the small MS4s in the country, and the
large MS4s.
Yeah, the large MS4s. Mm-hmm. And most of the large MS4s are covered by individual permits. We issued individual permits for those large MS4s. And the regulation, the 40 CFR regulations, had a very lengthy application requirements for the Phase 1 community. So they had to submit this two-part application. Some of it was general information, and then other parts were categorizing their system, doing sampling based on land use areas for various pollutants. And then they were required to develop a stormwater program to reduce the discharge of pollutants to the maximum extent practicable. So just to talk a little bit about this MEP standard. That is the standard that municipal discharges of stormwater are held to. And it's considered to be, there's not a precise definition that we can point to anywhere that says MEP means this. It's kind of it's a little bit of a moving target because it's an iterative process, and you need to keep going back and revisiting what BMPs are being implemented and make adjustments. And MEP for a large city or town may be very different than what MEP would be for a smaller community. So it's the maximum extent practicable for the community. So the needs of one community may be different than the needs of another community. So this is somewhat of a difficult thing to actually define, but that is the standard that the municipal discharges are held to. So what's it envisioned is that municipality will implement a stormwater management program, evaluate the effectiveness of it, meaning are they seeing improvements, are things changing, is the water quality getting better? And if not, then they need to go back and review what's going on and make adjustments and try something different, which is the iterative process. So that's kind of a little snippet of MEP. I don't know if Nikos wants to add something to that.
Well, I think that's a very good description. For better or worse, this is one of those things that is not clearly defined, and it is unique to the Stormwater program. In the Clean Water Act, there are other standards that apply best available technology, which we'll explain in a minute, or water quality standards. But for stormwater, there was a thought back when this program was created that something different was appropriate for stormwater because stormwater really is a very unique and difficult source to control. So I think Thelma's sort of key points there, one, that it is an iterative approach. So EPA kind of expects from permit cycle to permit cycle every 5 years that the programs will continue to grow and expand and refine what they're doing. Obviously, water quality is a piece of that, so the ultimate goal is to improve water quality down the road. And so water quality should be the thing that's kind of informing what we do next in the program. Are we making progress, as Thelma said, or not? And also those differences between the kinds of communities that are out there. Obviously, smaller communities don't have the kinds of resources that bigger ones do, so there's not an equivalency there, but it's sort of appropriate to your conditions.
Right. And one of the things with the Phase 1, just quickly wrap that up, was Phase 1 did have monitoring requirements in it, and we issued the permits. Most of the permits for Phase 1 communities were issued in the early 90s, so we're on the second or third iteration for Phase 1 communities. The Phase 2 program, because it's based on an urbanized area definition defined by the Census Bureau. And an urbanized area is, as I mentioned, it's a Census Bureau definition that takes a central core and does an algorithm and calculates out based on population density to figure out who's in. So what happens is, as we saw in the previous map, it's not drawn along political boundaries. So oftentimes communities that border larger urbanized areas are brought into this program because they're on the fringe of the urbanized area. So they're in the program. And we will look at, because the Census Bureau happens every 10 years, there'll be another census in 2010, so potentially more communities will be brought into the program. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this webcast, when we were talking about the authorities, that we always have this extra authority to designate anybody else that we feel needs to have a permit coverage. So EPA has the authority, as well as the states, to pull in communities that are not in the defined urbanized area as needing a permit, or, as I mentioned earlier, to require communities that have a partial piece in an urbanized area to implement their program in the entire urbanized area. And then, as we were just talking earlier, it also includes these what we call non-traditional types of entities, including, the military bases, public universities, and prisons. And all these folks are, if they're located in the urbanized area, they are subject to the permitting requirements, as well as the what we call traditional cities and towns in the program.
Okay, this map shows the urbanized areas in the United States according to the 2000 census. So, as Thelma was just mentioning, there are 464 urbanized areas, those sort of core areas of larger population. They cover some 5,000 plus communities across the United States, as we saw in that example of Allentown, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Many of the suburban areas, too, are included. 197 million people are in the urbanized area, so about 70% of the United States, and interestingly lives on about 2% of the land area. So again, if we go back to those water quality statistics that I was showing you at the very beginning, and we look at the percentages, even if we know those aren't the greatest percentages in the world, we can see here that 2% of the land area is having 10, 15, 30% of the impacts on the waters that have been assessed so far. So the relative magnitude of impact of urban land per square acre is pretty high, and in fact it's, I think, the highest of all the different land uses is urbanized areas in terms of the impacts it will have on water quality.
For the Phase 2 program, as we're talking about permits, typically we issue the general permits, and there are some instances where individual permits have been issued for the Phase 2 municipalities. And similar to the Phase 1 municipalities, Phase 2 municipalities need to develop and implement what's called a stormwater management program. And again, the same standard applies to the Phase 2 folks, that they need to reduce the pollutants to the maximum extent practicable. Typically, Phase 2 communities don't have a monitoring requirement. EPA typically doesn't have it in their permits. States certainly can put monitoring in their permit, but it was not an initial component. It may come in the second permit term that we're doing, because most of the Phase 2 permits are expiring right around now, 2008, 2009, since the first permits came out in 2003. And so the second permit term may have some monitoring requirements in it. So basically, for the way it works for the municipal permit is that EPA or the state would issue a general permit, and then municipalities would be required to submit what's called a notice of intent. And the notice of intent was to say what BMPs they were going to be using to meet the conditions of the permit, and say that they're eligible for the permit. And what EPA will do is review the NOIs, and we accept public comment on the notices of intent that come in. And basically, I always describe the notice of intent as the plan of your program. The initial NOIs that came in basically outlined how municipalities were going to implement a program to meet the conditions of the first general permit. And the setup is that, the permit requires 6 minimum control measures to be implemented. And Nikos going to go over quickly what those 6 minimum measures are.
Okay, we've got a couple slides on each one of these minimum measures, and as John mentioned before, we do have a whole series of webcasts, so we have covered the details of each one of these 6 in great detail. So if you do want to know more than we're covering today, tune into those archived webcasts. You can listen to them anytime. But we do have the 6 minimum measures: public education, public involvement, illicit discharge, construction, post-construction, and pollution prevention or municipal operations is the last one. So first, a little bit about public education and involvement. And it occurs to me that this is one of our more sort of fundamental pieces of the stormwater program. If you think back to that map that I just showed you, something 70% or so of the population of the United States is essentially covered by the NPDES stormwater program. And people everywhere in their everyday lives are contributing to stormwater problems, whether they're fertilizing their lawns too much or using pesticides, or perhaps at their place of business, they have a parking lot that's draining right into a stream without any kind of stormwater controls. There's a whole range of places where people in their daily lives and in their business lives impact stormwater. And so depending on what's going on in your community, the public education and involvement pieces, there are actually 2 minimum measures here, are very important. And so that's sort of the centerpiece of this diagram, but also keep in mind that public education and outreach is the central piece to each one of the minimum measures. So for instance, in the illicit discharge program, to make that program really work, if you can educate your citizenry to look out for those illicit discharges and call them into you, and report them to you so you can go track them down, you'll have a much more effective program. Same for any of these minimum measures. Another example would be in post-construction, to educate your builders and your developers about post-construction BMPs and the importance of low-impact development kinds of techniques and the kinds of things that they want to be putting into those new developments. So it does reach out into all 6 of the minimum measures. So a little bit about public education. Of course, every MS4 is required to implement a public education program. The regulations say to distribute materials about the impacts of stormwater. And if you just follow what is the minimum required there, you're probably not going to have a very good public education program. So EPA recommends and has a very nice manual called the Getting in Step Manual for outreach campaigns. Website is listed there. It's also on your resource document. I don't think we mentioned that, Sonia, that we have a resource document available to people. It's available on one of the buttons on your website there, and gives you some of the essential resources so you don't have to scramble and write down all these URLs today. But here we're talking about going through this process, starting at the bottom with the building blocks there about identifying some key things about your audience, what they know, what they don't know about stormwater, setting some objectives for the kinds of things that you want to accomplish, and then moving upward, targeting your key audience, refining your message, developing a format for delivering that message, whether it's through TV, website, print media, through a network, some kind of informal network in the community, etc. And then finally evaluating that effort, again, as Thelma mentioned, the iterative approach, evaluating it to find out whether it was effective. Did people change their behaviors? And if not, then we go back to the beginning and start that cycle again. So lots more on public education in our webcast. We've had a couple webcasts on that topic and also through that Getting in Step manual. The third minimum measure is illicit discharge detection and elimination. And this, for this minimum measure, we are lucky enough to have a manual developed for us by the Center for Watershed Protection, which is featured there. And it helps, this manual really helps communities to run through a very logical process for assessing the situation in their communities and then setting up a program that makes sense for them. So some of the key things there, of course, are having an ordinance in place, and that ordinance needs to prohibit non-stormwater discharges to your system. It needs to give you access so that you can go and do your inspections and investigatory work when you need to. And, of course, when you do find a problem, it's got to provide you with a way of correcting that one way or the other. Sometimes that might be through a fine or penalty or the ability to compel somebody to correct, say, a cross-connection from a sanitary sewer system. Also, we're looking for a map of the outfalls in the system. The manual, one thing I want to point out is that it does a really good job of getting you to assess the different sub-watersheds that you're dealing with so that you can better target all your illicit discharge investigations to areas where you really do have a potential for possible problems. And then it also goes into how to train your system, how to track all these things, and again, that public education piece. Thelma, do you want to talk a little bit about the construction measure?
Sure. The construction minimum control measure also requires an ordinance like the illicit discharge minimum measure. And the ordinance is to require construction projects within your community to utilize proper sediment and erosion control and good housekeeping practices. You need to be able to submit, be able to review plans that are submitted, and have the ability to assess fines and penalties if somebody is not following your local requirements. The important thing is something that when you have the plan review process, it should be an integrated process. It should include people that understand what's happening in the plans, reviewing the plans, and have opportunities for comments on those plans, for interaction with the public on the plans. And a post-construction piece should also be incorporated into the plan. So you want to know what they're going to be doing while the construction is taking place, but then also how is the stormwater to be managed after construction. You should have some type of inspections of all these facilities or all these projects, and the ability to respond to any complaints. And again, as Nikos talked earlier, this measure also can tie into your education process where you're educating the developers that are going to be coming into the community on what exactly they need to do. And this is one of those ones that there's layers with the construction program. So there's the local requirement, but there's also the federal construction permit that would also, or potentially could also apply to construction projects within your community.
Yeah, and post-construction is very similar to construction. It's actually often implemented together, but the basic requirement is to develop and implement a post-construction program for all new developments or redevelopments greater than an acre. There is a requirement for an ordinance to require plan review, design specs, maintenance, and also requirements for a plan review process and a program to ensure that maintenance is conducted and training. There's a screenshot of a new post-construction guidance that the Center for Watershed Protection has put out. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides.
minimum measure deals with, it's actually called Good Housekeeping in Municipal Operations. And basically what's required in this is kind of another separate, it's kind of another program within your program to deal with pollution prevention activities in municipal operations. And it has a training component. You're supposed to train your employees, and you can certainly use our webcast series to help train your employees on some of the issues that deal with stormwater. You should have standard operating procedures, for things such as how frequently are the streets swept, how frequently are the catch basins cleaned, what is the schedule. All these things should be thought about and documented and planned out. And the municipal operations section doesn't just cover the cities and the city streets and the sidewalks. It's all the municipal operations that exist. So it's the buildings, it's the vehicles, it's the parks, it's the schools, the transfer stations. All of those pieces need to be taken into account and evaluated, and opportunities for pollution prevention activities to take place. For industrial facilities, this is for the municipal program subject to Phase 1. They had another component that dealt with the industrial side of their the industrial discharges into their system, and they had to control and monitor the discharges from those industrial facilities that discharge directly to their municipal system. And this was a requirement that only applied to the Phase 1 municipal systems.
And Thelma, I would add that for Phase 2 communities, while it's not spelled out so clearly, the illicit discharge minimum measure is a logical place for Phase 2 municipalities to look at commercial and industrial facilities as well. And actually the guidance document has some very useful information about how to deal with that within a Phase 2 program. So it was, in some ways, not called out separately as it was in Phase 1, but also in some ways, I think, implied in the illicit discharge minimum measure. So now, real quickly, just some other pieces of this. There is a provision that MS4 should pay attention to, and it's, we call it, quote-unquote, shared responsibility. This is in the regulations, now that you know these things, the Code of Federal Regulations at 122.35, which you can find on our website most easily. But this is a place where the Phase 2 regulations provide the opportunity for MS4s to share responsibilities. And in my way of thinking, there's sort of two ways to do this. One would be where a group of municipalities band together and create a program or a piece of the program together. For instance, we had the example of Burlington, Vermont, which I think we mentioned in a couple of other webcasts, where the 15 or so communities around Burlington, Vermont banded together and each contributed $5,000 to come up with a very nice public education outreach campaign. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, though, may be where you're actually going to rely on somebody else to do something for you. So, for instance, in the case of a community where the county has a very good sediment erosion control program, and they're doing all the things that are required by the Phase 2 requirements already, that community can say, well, the county program suffices. They're doing all these things, so we're going to rely on them. We don't need to develop another program. So those are some things that MS4 should take advantage of, particularly the sharing, I think, in so many of these different things makes a lot of sense, particularly for smaller communities.
And just to add that, it's important. There's a lot of information and a lot of stuff that's going on, and there's no need for folks to reinvent the wheel if something is already existing in their area that they can build on or work with or form partnerships with to get things done. So it's important to, look at what's happening within your community and within your area to see if there's somebody you can partner with or something that's already existing that you can build on so that you're not trying to start from scratch from something.
Absolutely, and I think the resource document gives some opportunities for that. Folks might want to look at the listserv and join the listserv that is mentioned there, and also the non-point source toolbox for education and outreach has examples from all across the country of different things that you can use. So just to summarize the MS4 permits here, as Thelma mentioned, most Phase 1 permits are in their second or third, or some even starting their fourth permitting cycle. Phase 2 was required to have permit coverage by March 10th, 2003, and then, as we mentioned, they have 5 years to get the program fully up and running. Now, we know that because states issued permits at different times, that time frame is thrown off sometimes, so that's kind of a generalization, and that both of these programs require annual or periodic reporting. So now we come to the answer to the next one, and I understand there was a technical problem, and this one didn't show up for most people. But the question was, for those who weren't able to see it, the Phase 2 regulations provide the following time frame for MS4s to fully set up their programs after they get permit coverage. And the right answer was 5 years, as you can see there. And then the bottom has a little bit more details on the framework. So again, the regulations, as we discovered, were issued in 1999, and then permits had until March 2003 to issue those permits. I mentioned that a number of permitting authorities, including EPA in a couple of cases. We have to admit that we didn't always meet the deadline as well. We're a little late there. And then after that, MS4s generally had about 90 days to actually get that permit coverage, and then a 5-year window after that to get their programs up and running. So right now, for many states and many communities, basically at the end of the first permit cycle. So we are expecting that many folks have their programs up and running at this point. And so, John, why don't we cover the post-construction guidance real quickly, and then we'll move to more questions.
Okay. Just briefly, because this will be the subject of our next webcast, the Center for Water Protection, working with Tetra Tech and EPA, has developed a comprehensive guide on post-construction, so for a Phase 2 community on how to develop a post-construction program. And this is set up very similar to the illicit discharge manual that CWP did a couple of years ago. We're anticipating, it says summer 2008. We're actually anticipating publishing this next week on CWP's website, and you have both websites on there. So just quickly, here's the different chapters, and it does step through the basic components of developing and implementing a program. So it goes from program development in Chapter 2, talking about linking stormwater and land use, in Chapter 3 to different stormwater criteria and approaches, developing an ordinance and stormwater guidance manual, all the way through plan review, inspections, maintenance, and tracking and evaluating your program. So it's a very comprehensive guide. It also includes a number of tools to help you develop your program, things like a model ordinance, a self-audit tool, checklists, and various things like that. So with that, Nikos, I will turn it over to Sonia to ask a couple questions.
Thanks, John. And yes, the questions keep rolling in, and based on our second poll question, we have over 3,300 people listening in today. So we cannot answer all the questions posted during this webcast, and we're running just a little bit behind, but we will try to answer as many as we can. So let's see our next question. Christine is wondering if an MS4 conveyance can also be a water of the U.S. For example, can a water owned and operated by a regulated MS4 be part of the MS4 system? Thelma or Nikos?
Okay, I said we could take hard questions, but that's a really hard one.
Very hard one.
I would say that generally speaking, that doesn't tend to happen. Most MS4 conveyance systems are, as Thelma mentioned, the roads, the streets, the gutters, the underground infrastructure. So oftentimes those are not obviously waters of the U.S. Now, there are some cases where this can get a little bit gray, where we have these open channels. And so there has been some discussion about that, where there may be some overlapping situations where some of these things are considered waters of the U.S. and are also part of that conveyance system. So there may be some limited cases where there's some overlap. So if the person that asked that question wants to send an email in, we might be able to provide a little bit more information on some of those case studies. But I would say, kind of as a generalization, wouldn't you say that you agree with this, Thelma? It's generally the things are pretty separate.
Pretty much so, yes.
Great. Thanks, Nikos and Thelma.
Okay, easy questions.
Okay, John, this one is for you. Ray in St. Louis County wants to know if an urbanized area cuts a community in half, is the whole community included in the MS4 and even the portion that is not in the urbanized area?
Yeah, technically, I guess it can depend on your general Phase 2 MS4 permit, but in general, it's only the urbanized area part of the county or city is included in the permitted area. A lot of times the cities have addressed the entire incorporated boundary, but I think technically it is only the urbanized portion of that city that is included.
Well, and I'm sort of shaking my head a little bit because at the regulatory level, remember we had that graphic before, at the regulatory level, yes, it's the urbanized area. But then we move into the permit realm, remember, and the 45 states have the ability to make their own decisions in the permit realm, and lots of states actually have included the entire community. So in order to answer this question, you actually need to read the permit in your particular state because it is going to vary state by state. But when you see it on the EPA website, we are talking about what's identified in the census. But then there's that second level where the states make decisions using that designation authority that Thelma mentioned earlier.
All right, great. Now, we do want to get through the rest of the session, so that wraps up the second Q&A session. But I do want to mention that we do have one more opportunity for questions and answers, so please keep submitting your hard questions. Nikos?
Okay, thanks, Sonia, for setting that up for me. So we're going to try, we are running a little bit late, unfortunately. We're going to extend this just a little bit, so just stick with us so we can get through all the material. So we'll cover the construction section next very quickly. As I mentioned before, we do have a lot of webcasts already on this topic, so I'm just going to go over this very briefly. So we do cover construction, the discharges of stormwater from construction sites during the active construction period. And back in 1999, remember when we finalized the Phase 2 rule, we did estimate that approximately 400,000 construction sites would be covered by the Phase 1 and Phase 2 program. And obviously that's going to vary widely every year depending on the economic conditions in the country. Maybe for the last 10 years we had a lot of construction sites. As we know, there was a lot of development the last couple of years. Obviously that has changed rather dramatically. So this number is going to go up and down every year. Obviously, for construction, the primary pollutant that we're concerned about is sediment, but one of the things that distinguishes the NPDES stormwater program from a lot of existing sediment erosion control laws that have been out there that often predate the NPDES program is that we do focus also on these other pollutants that may be generated at a construction site, including things like trash and debris and concrete washout, paints and chemicals that might be spilled, and those sorts of things. So this next graphic here just shows the potential for erosion from an uncontrolled construction site, and you can see over on the far right, bare soil in an unmanaged construction site might yield something like 35 to 45 tons of sediment per acre per year. And going all the way over to the left, a forested site is far less than 1 ton per year. In fact, it's probably less than 100 pounds per year, actually. So the differences can be quite dramatic, and that's why the NPDES program is concerned with construction, is because of that potential for large amounts of sediment to come off these sites in a very short amount of time. So again, as we've said all along, this is about prevention or minimizing the impact of construction. So we are looking at erosion control. It's a very important part of this. We're looking at keeping the soil in place. So for those who don't know, erosion control is basically aimed at keeping the sediment in place. And sediment controls, if it starts to move, we want to catch it in a silt fence before it leaves the site. Now, one of the things that you'll see out there very often is that people only use sediment controls. I mean, many of us have driven by a construction site, and the only visible BMP out there is a silt fence. But one of the things that we want to start to change is to see more of those controls, whether it be matting or mulching or seeding, to keep that sediment in place. And so that's really the mark of good construction control at a construction site. And of course, as I mentioned, the other ways too. We want to make sure that we control all of those. Standards We've talked about this a little bit, and this applies both to construction and industrial, so I will summarize it real quick here. But basically, the Clean Water Act requires us to meet both technology-based standards, which are generally best available technology, and water quality-based standards. So this is different than the municipal program where Thelma talked about maximum extent practicable. And right now in the construction program, basically, we've dealt with these two standards through the imposition of BMPs. So if you look at permits, they will require that construction operators implement BMPs to prevent sediment erosion problems at a construction site. And if they do all those things right, then we presume that that meets these standards. And I should mention that may start to change in the future. EPA is working on an effluent guideline for the construction industry right now, and that would affect the technology-based side of it, and also in the water quality-based side of it as we implement TMDLs, which was one of the questions before. If a stream segment is impaired for sediment or TSS, total suspended solids, we may have specific requirements for construction sites through that route as well. But generally, in our permits, we're handling those through a suite of BMPs that require construction site operators to implement.
Yeah, Nikos, this slide summarizes the activities regulated under the NPDES program for construction. As Thelma mentioned earlier, large construction above 5 acres is actually categorized as an industrial activity and regulated under that section of the Clean Water Act. Small construction, the Phase 2, was actually designated under other water quality protections of the Clean Water Act. So that's between 1 and 5 acres. And the reason they did that is because of that challenge from NRDC that said 5 acres was arbitrary and capricious. Well, what EPA did was they lowered it essentially to 1 acre, but it's a fuzzy 1 acre. There's waivers that allow sites between 1 and 5 acres out of the program if they demonstrate no water quality impacts, and there's designations below 1 acre if they're causing a water quality impact. So it is 1 acre, but with some exemptions. And then the definition of construction does include clearing, grading, excavating. But it's important to remember that's more than just house or building construction. That can be, road construction, utility lines, built, new golf course constructed, anything that does disturb ground, except of course agricultural, which is exempt from the Stormwater program by the Clean Water Act. And then we also didn't want to introduce the concept of this common plan. So if your activity includes a common plan to develop a parcel, say above an acre or above 5 acres, but you're implementing that common plan in pieces, say 4 or 5 quarter-acre lots individually, that would be covered by the program, even though you're only disturbing a quarter acre at a time. If your common plan is above the 1 acre in size, then all those individual activities in that common plan are covered. And we'll move on now. Nikos will talk about some waivers.
So we have in the construction program, as John mentioned, for small construction only, that is construction under 5 acres, we do have a low erosivity waiver possibility. EPA offers this in its construction general permit, and some other states do, and it is a state choice, again, as to whether they want to offer this waiver or not. But this would apply in dry areas, particularly in places where we don't have a lot of rainfall or where during a particular part of the season there's very little chance of rainfall. And so we use an erosivity factor, and there's a calculator on the NPDES website to see whether you can apply for this waiver or not. But if there's little chance of rain during our construction program, you might be able to apply for that waiver and opt out of the program. The Phase 2 regulations also mention a couple of other waivers, the water quality waiver and TMDL waiver, which I'm not going to get into. We actually don't offer those actively through the permitting program at EPA, but they are described on our website in some more detail if you want to find out about those. And qualifying local programs, another thing that I wanted to mention, similar but different from the shared responsibility that I mentioned for municipalities. This applies to construction programs and does allow a way for us to streamline the construction program. And EPA is actually working on this right now and hopes to implement it in the next 6 months or so in our construction general permit. As we mentioned before, EPA is the permitting authority in 5 states and some other areas, and so we're hoping to do that. But basically what we're trying to do here is recognize strong local programs that have good ordinances in place, and when we recognize those in the state or in the EPA construction general permit, then we can basically streamline the requirements that a construction site operator would need to follow. So just because we're almost out of time, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but if you want to read more about it, there is a document on our website about that. So just to kind of summarize, the EPA Construction General Permit was initially issued in 1992, and we've had several iterations, including the 2008 version, which just came out last month. Of course, authorized states issue their own construction general permits. And so that takes us to quiz answer number 5 here. And so the question was, EPA issues a construction general permit. This permit, and the first option was, applies to construction sites nationally. The second option, which as you can see there is the correct answer, applies only to construction sites in certain areas where EPA remains the permitting authority. And then you have some other options, particularly the next one, which asked you if EPA CGP has any implications for an authorized state. So let's see how people did with answering this. And I've got to report again that our class did not do so well on this one. So we had about 5% who said A, applies nationally. 13% actually got the right answer, which is B right there. 10% said C, and then most people, 37 and 34%, said B and C or A and C. So lots of people got that one a little bit wrong. So again, getting back to that framework that we showed you before, if you remember that graphic that I showed you, the Clean Water Act applies nationally, the EPA regulations apply nationally, and then permits apply in places where mostly state by state, and in the case of EPA permits, in the 5 states that we deal with. So our permits really affect the activities in the states that we are the permitting authority for. So hopefully that answers that one. And let's see. Thelma was going to talk a little bit about a SWIP, so I'll turn it over to her.
Okay. Well, a SWIP is a stormwater pollution prevention plan, and it's what we require. It's the basis of the permit requirements is that construction projects need to develop and implement a stormwater pollution prevention plan. It needs to be in place prior to submitting your notice of intent for coverage, and basically it identifies what the sources of pollutants are, what are the BMPs that you're going to be implementing to control those pollutants, and it requires it defines frequency of inspections and different types of schedules that need to be that will be implemented on the site, and it identifies who's responsible for what aspect of the plan's implementation. And EPA actually has a really good guide for developing a stormwater pollution prevention plan. It's called the Guide to Developing Your Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, and it's available on our website. And it steps you through all the different requirements of the plan and, things you should look for and things such as that. So I encourage folks to go to the website and download it and view it.
Thanks, Thelma. And just a little bit of detail about this. Actually, I was the manager of this project, and so this document, besides the document or the guidance document itself, it also includes a template, a SWIP template, which guides you through the process. It's in Word, so you can download it and type right into it and customize it for the permit requirements in your particular state. We also have an inspection form. Construction sites are required to self-inspect their own sites on a periodic basis. That varies from state to state depending on the requirements. But it gives you a form to walk you around the site and help you inspect. And we've also developed, if you haven't looked at this recently, at this website recently, we've developed 2 example SWIP where we took two hypothetical projects, a residential project and a commercial project, and we filled out all the forms in detail so you can see what that looks like. So all those things are available to you at that website that we just mentioned. And now, John, I think we're at quiz answer number 6. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and number 6 here is how many levels of NPDES stormwater requirements does a construction company have to comply with? And as you can see, the correct answer there was B, which is EPA or state, because, of course, you know, the permitting authority is either an authorized state or it's EPA, so that's an or, and local if applicable. So the correct answer is 1 or 2 levels. As we discussed, an MS4 is required to have a construction program, so they will have, but if you're outside of an MS4 in an unincorporated area, you're not going to have an NPDES-derived requirement, although that community may have its own requirements as well or may not. But if you are in an MS4, the answer would be 2. So let's see how people did. And yet again, oh well. I guess these questions were really hard. But anyway, 2% said 1. Okay, so we know there's some cynics out there anyway that figured that 1 just cannot possibly be the right answer. 37% actually got it right, so that's good. The state or EPA and the local if applicable. 60% said 3 levels. And then, again, the cynics, again, said, no, it can't be just 1. It's got to be more. So,
well, in defense of the folks that said 3, I have to say that in my region, where EPA is the permitting authority, the 2 states that we have authority over also have programs. So a construction project within my region and those 2 states could have a local MS4 program, could have a state requirement, as well as EPA's program. So in defense of those folks that answered to that question, that still could be right in certain areas.
It was a trick question.
It was a trick question, though.
Oh, okay.
Because it says NPDES stormwater requirement.
Okay.
So anyway, there you have the answers. And again, we're going to extend, I think, for a few minutes because we do want some opportunity to answer questions. So stick with us. We have run a little bit over. We had a lot of material to cover. So let's get quickly into the industrial program. John's going to start us off on that one. We'll run through the industrial requirements real quick, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Yeah, that's great, Nikos. And so we will run about 10 minutes past the hour for those of you listening in. The industrial program is a separate NPDES permit program to issue to approximately 100,000 industrial facilities. And the pollutants will obviously vary by industry sector, but you're looking at, heavy metals, suspended solids, oils, and grease, and, all the types of pollutants you would expect from these categories. We'll go through the individual categories in a couple of slides, but these are primarily your heavy manufacturing and processing types of facilities. And it can include any, federal, state, or municipally owned facilities. So, for example, one of the categories is wastewater treatment plant discharges, stormwater discharges from wastewater treatment plants. So those are obviously municipally owned, and if they're covered, they should be required to comply. And then we also cover the no exposure provision in a little bit more detail with some additional slides. But those facilities, if they qualify, are not required to submit for permit coverage, but they must submit this no exposure certification to let EPA know that they don't need to apply. So similar to construction, and we're not going to cover this slide in any detail, because very similar to construction, there's 2 clean water standards for industrial stormwater sources, the technology-based standards and water quality-based standards. The technology-based standards being essentially the BMPs and SWIP requirements.
John, it might be interesting to note for people, unlike construction, on those technology-based requirements for industrial, there are actually effluent guidelines in place, and effluent guideline is a national regulation that covers an industry category. And so there are quite a number of effluent guidelines that apply to the industrial stormwater program.
Okay, and then also similar to construction, industrial facilities are required to develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan, and the details of that SWIP are generally covered in the general permit issued to that facility or issued for that state. And again, these rely on BMPs rather than end-of-pipe controls. The BMPs generally being a lot of good housekeeping type practices, cover, and things like that. So here you can see the different major categories of industrial activities that are covered. Again, things like the heavy manufacturing, landfills, recycling facilities, public transportation type facilities, sewage treatment plants. As we discussed before, large construction is technically a regulated industrial category, but that's typically covered under a separate general permit, so we cover that under the category that Nikos just covered. However, there is this category of light industrial activity, and what happened in Phase 2 is these facilities were basically exempt. They were told, if you don't think you need a permit, you don't need to come in, you don't need to talk to EPA, you don't need to do anything. Well, EPA was sued on that and found that these facilities shouldn't be essentially self-certifying that they weren't causing a problem. EPA shouldn't leave it up to them to decide. So EPA needs to issue some guidance or form to help them decide whether they're eligible for this no exposure or not. So EPA developed the form with Phase 2, developed more specific requirements, so any industrial facility can qualify for this no exposure if they meet certain requirements and notify EPA. So what is this no exposure provision? Again, the original only applied to those light industrial activities, and no certification was required. With the court case, though, it was changed where there is now a no exposure certification form you can download from EPA's website, and if you answer all the questions and check off that you are not providing any industrial activity as outside, you're not doing any exposing any activities to stormwater runoff, you could qualify for this no exposure provision and essentially not need to comply or apply for the NPDES permit. So it leaves these facilities that are essentially all the activities are conducted indoors. It lets them out of the NPDES stormwater permit program. And I think Thelma was going to talk about the MSGP.
Well, the multi-sector general permit is the permit we use to regulate industrial discharges. There's different sectors depending on different types of industrial activity, 29 in total. And again, it deals with stormwater pollution prevention plans, which are typically the BMPs. The original permit, which was published in 1995, was developed based on using specific industry data that we collected during the group application process that took place in the early 90s, which doesn't exist anymore. But based on all the information we got from that, we developed the 1995 version of the multi-sector permit. We reissued it in 2000, and we public noticed a new version of it at the end of 2005, and it should be reissued soon. And each of the states, the individual states that are authorized have their own industrial permits. Some have the multi-sector permit, and some just have a general industrial permit covering their facilities.
It's true, and you heard Thelma sort of backpedal there a little bit on the reissuance, but we do expect it has been expired for a long time, and the latest that I've heard is that it will be out by the beginning of September. And trust me, we in EPA have been waiting for a long time for this too, and want to do it as quickly as we can. And Thelma also mentioned too that we call it a multi-sector general permit, but if you're looking for it in your particular state, it may be called something different. So that takes us, I think, to quiz question number 7. Boy, we went through that really fast. So here's my favorite question out of all of these. 80% removal of total suspended solids. And first option was there is a Clean Water Act requirement that applies to all discharges, including stormwater, which was incorrect. Is a Clean Water Act requirement that applies to wastewater treatment plants, also incorrect. Cannot be found in the Clean Water Act and does not apply to NPDES stormwater is the correct answer. And it's just amazing. This is one of those great urban myths that exists for the stormwater program. You will find this all over the place. People will mention it in speeches and conferences. You'll see it in brochures for different devices that you can buy, that EPA requires 80% removal of TSS. Well, now you know the truth, folks. This is not true at all. In fact, we actually have an entire webcast that we did several months ago on the whole issue of BMP performance, and we don't even like percent removal as a way of measuring the performance of BMPs. So there's a whole lot of things wrong with this one, but it is one of those great urban myths that keeps circulating. So let's see what came up in terms of answers here. 32% answered A. Let's see, 14% answered B. Only 17% got it right. And 36% answered D there. So, again, not doing so well, but we hope that you've got this as a take-home message. And anytime you see this 80% removal, you can intelligently tell people this is not a Clean Water Act requirement. All right, so now we said we're going to extend a little bit here, so let's take some questions from the audience because I know we do have a lot, but we do have some flexibility here, so folks, stick with us, and let's try to answer, 5 or 6 or 7 questions if we can get to them.
All right, Nikos, we do have a few minutes to answer additional questions, but first I want to remind you that this seminar will be archived, so you can access it after today's live presentation. The archived webcast will be posted within a few weeks. Revisit EPA's NPDES training website to view this archived presentation. As a reminder, we have posted the speaker's contact information in case you would like to contact them after today. And as Nikos mentioned earlier, you can find a comprehensive resource list by pressing the Resources button on your screen. You will need Adobe Acrobat Reader to view this document. Finally, a webcast evaluation survey should soon appear on your screen. Please complete the survey and let us know your thoughts. We do appreciate your feedback as we work to improve our webcast. And if you do not see an evaluation survey on your screen, please turn off your pop-up blocker. And as an added note, don't forget to download the certificate. Click on the certificate button to print the certificate after this webcast because it will not be mailed to you. Now, there was a problem with the certificate, but it is now fixed. All you have to do is press the key F5 on your keyboard to refresh your console webpage. So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes so that you guys can refresh. And please let us know if you still cannot download a certificate. And as always, if there are multiple people in the room with you, you can click on this link to customize your certificate and print a copy for everyone attending. Now we have time for additional questions. So this first question is for Thelma. Timothy from South Carolina has asked, if a construction site is not located within an MS4 area, is it still required to have an NPDES permit?
If the construction site is not located in the MS4 area, my guess would be that the state would have a construction permit that perhaps would apply. There needs to be a point source discharge, as we talked about at the beginning of the webcast, so you need to have a discharge of pollutants to a water of the state for needing a permit. So if there is a discharge, it does need a permit.
Yeah, so I think the generalized answer to that in most parts of the country is that the answer would be yes, and they would need coverage under the state construction general permit if that construction site discharged an acre above, as we mentioned, or was part of a larger common plan of development for some of the smaller ones, and as Thelma mentioned. So most places in the United States have that potential for a discharge to a water of the U.S., so we would certainly strongly recommend that they get permit coverage.
All right, great. And John, Nancy from Missouri wants to know, if an industry discharges to a permitted MS4, does that industry need an NPDES permit?
The answer to that depends on the type of industry and whether it's specifically required to get coverage under the multi-sectoral general permit or the state's industrial general permit. So it really doesn't matter whether they discharge to MS4 or not. If they're covered under one of those SOC codes in the industrial general permit, then no matter where they're at, within MS4, outside MS4, as long as they're discharging to a water U.S., they need NPDES permit coverage for their industrial stormwater services.
And again, that's for the stormwater sources. And just to clarify, maybe I didn't quite hear this right, but if the industry cannot discharge processed wastewater to a storm sewer system. And if they did, that would be a violation of a whole bunch of different things. But for their stormwater discharges, if it's an industrial site that's covered, as John mentioned, they would meet stormwater coverage under an industrial permit.
All right. Now, Nikos, Robert in Montana mentions that increases in stormwater quantity discharges can often result in negative water quality impacts. How is quantity addressed in the stormwater regulations?
That's a good question, and as we've been discussing all day today, we are obviously very concerned about the volumes of stormwater coming off of different places. But if you look at I think a strict reading of the Clean Water Act requirements and the regulations, you're going to see much more of a focus on the pollutants. And so where we're at today basically is that we are providing guidance that people should be paying attention to the volume aspects as well. And you'll see some of that also now starting to crop up in different state permits in different ways as well. So it can be addressed on a sort of state-by-state or permit-by-permit basis as well. But if you look at the as I said, if you look at the Clean Water Act, you're not going to see too many words that really relate to that very clearly.
All right, thanks, Nikos. And Thelma, Jill from South Dakota asks, since large construction activities, those greater than 5 acres, are considered industrial activities, do those construction sites have more regulations than small construction sites that are 1 to 5 acres? And do they have any regulations that fall under both the industrial and construction?
Well,
do you want me to answer that?
yeah, you can. Yeah.
I can't speak for every state out there, but for EPA, there's really not much difference in our permit between large and small. In fact, there's no particular difference right at that break point between 5 acres and above and 5 acres and below. In our permit, the one thing that comes to my mind that is different, that kicks in when you've got a drainage area of 10 acres or more, is that you need to have a sediment pond. So we do have that requirement. Now, states may vary and have different things, but basically those requirements are the same. There's not a whole lot of difference, except that sometimes you'll see, like in our permit, that 10-acre requirement for a sediment pond.
All right, great. And Nikos?
Is this going to be a hard question, Sonia?
This depends. Now, Nikos, to wrap up this session, Vivian wants to go back to the basics. Please explain why stormwater is a point source.
Okay, that's a good question. I think we can easily answer that one. Stormwater is a point source because, as we described, the MS4 system, the municipal separate storm sewer system that most communities have, is a system of conveyance. And if you look at the details in the Clean Water Act as to what makes up a point source, any kind of system that conveys stormwater is a point source. So as Thelma mentioned earlier, the pipes under the streets, and actually the curbs and the streets themselves are a conveyance system. If you have open channels next to a roadway, those are part of the conveyance system as well. So any of those things make up the definition in the Clean Water Act of a point source. Construction is also mentioned specifically in the Clean Water Act as a point source. So Congress made a determination that construction was a point source as well. Industrial facilities, the stormwater in industrial facilities is eventually collected and conveyed someplace. So that fits as well. I think actually, do we have time for one more, Sonia?
No, actually, we
don't. Okay. All right, fine.
Well, thank you, Nikos. That certainly clarified things for me. So at this time, I'd like to conclude today's webcast. So thank you, Nikos, Thelma, and John for presenting today, and of course, thanks to everyone who joined us. If you are still having problems with the certificate, please follow the URL that is now on your screen and customize your own certificate. So our next Stormwater webcast is scheduled for September 3rd on the Center for Watershed Protection's new guide for building an effective post-construction program. This webcast will focus on the guide itself and provide tools for managing stormwater in your community. Registration will be announced about 2 weeks before the webcast, so please check EPA's NPDES training page at www.epa.gov/NPDES/training for the latest information. An announcement will also be sent out through NPDES News, so please sign up for this email newsletter if you have not done so already. That ends our webcast for today. Thank you for joining us.